So once again, we're very pleased to have our new members as part of our congregation. You probably remember, if you've been here a long time, but Jim's the one who built the pier in downtown. So anytime you go to the pier, you can say, oh, I go to church with that. I mean, he didn't build it himself, like out there with concrete, but he orchestrated that. And he has some good stories about that. Well, I know it's not just because it's Super Bowl Sunday that I'm calling a little bit of an audible. It's the culmination of everything that's happened this week. So the texts that we had today were the regular texts. And then as I told you in the announcements, today is 40 days after Christmas, so we have another set of texts for the presentation of Jesus for Candlemas. And I want to talk about that, and I want to tell you why. So you may not have seen this book before. It's normally a book we would bring out in November. The title of it is The Book of the Names of the Dead. And it's a book that we would bring out at All Saints' Day or when we're remembering those who have died in our congregation. But we had to bring it out this week for our preschool. Because one of the people on the helicopter last week was one of our preschool moms, Christina Mauser. And so we needed to spend some time with our kids in the school talking about what that meant, that one of our moms had been broken by death. And if you know Riney and Cheryl Klein, longtime members of our church, their goddaughter and her daughter were also on the helicopter. And so that accident last week, that tragedy last week, touched our church and our school in some pretty profound ways. And so those names are written in this book. And on Friday morning, we gathered the children from the school to do a special lament. Like, we needed to teach the children that part of the language of faith isn't just praise, thank you, God, I love you, God, yes, God, but also lament. Being able to tell God why, being able to tell God no, and to just let our tears be part of our story with God as we wait for God's redemption. And so for our school children, we used the verse from the Psalms, you keep my tears in your bottle, are they not written in your book? Psalm 56, verse 8. And there was a tradition in the ancient world that you would carry the tears of your loved ones in a little vial around your neck as a sort of token of love. And so the psalmist is saying that about God. God, I know my suffering matters to you, and you keep my tears, you count them in your book. I don't know, it was Einstein or someone who said that. If you can't explain it to a child, you don't really understand it. And so it's the same thing for our faith. If we can't explain to them the hope we have in Jesus, then maybe we've spent too much time in the theological library, and we need to be able to return to the school of life. And so that was our attempt on Friday to help shape that experience in a way appropriate for small children, but also for our larger community. The second part of this, which I mentioned to you last Sunday, is Monday I wasn't really around. I didn't have Bible study, we didn't have happy hour, didn't have a second Bible study. I was in LA all day at the Museum of Tolerance for World Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we were there from 10 in the morning till almost 9 at night. And it had been a joint program of the German government and various institutions around the world to do an act of listening and watching of testimony from the Holocaust. And so they asked us to essentially spend 10 hours listening to testimony and to have as our task to be witnesses to what happened. And this becomes an important part of our life, the burden or the responsibility or the joy of being a witness and being a reliable witness whose testimony can reveal what happened. And a lot of the survivors are passing away very quickly, and so that burden of testimony rests on us. And especially that reading from Micah that we had this morning about doing justice, part of doing justice is being a witness to the truth. And so I wanted to take what's happened this week, that calling to bear witness, and then also the tragedy that happened last Sunday, and to consider this holiday in the church, Candlemas. And the reason it's called Candlemas is this was the day in the church that people would bring in their candles for the year and have them blessed. Today maybe I would just bless your cell phone flashlights or something, because I'm not sure how often, or your Yankee candles or your Scentsy. but I'm not sure how many of us are burning candles. But the idea was, in the same way that when the wise men came, we were blessing houses and dwellings, today was a day to bless the sources of light. And we told the children this on Friday, that they are one of God's sources of light. They each had a little candle they were holding. Each of them is a source of light to witness to the truth. So the text that's assigned to this day is actually from the 2nd chapter of Luke, and it's the story when, according to the law, after a woman has had a child, she's purified in the temple. So Mary, Joseph, and the baby come to the temple, and Mary goes through the ritual of purification, which is offering a sacrifice. And if you read about this in Luke 2, you'll find out that the sacrificial system of the law of Moses has a sliding scale depending on your income. You know, sometimes they're not going to burden you with a sacrifice you can't afford. And so if you were wealthy, you would get a larger animal that you would sacrifice. If you were poor, you would buy some birds or something small. And so when Mary and Joseph make their sacrifice, we find out that they're poor because she offers a pair of birds. Offers, I think, some pigeons or some doves. I was down at the pier yesterday, and there are a lot of pigeons you could offer. But I guess we're not sacrificing. But you see that Mary and Joseph are coming to fulfill the obligation of ancestors, and then it's also the redeeming of the firstborn son. So it's kind of two things together, the purification of the Virgin Mary and the redeeming of the firstborn son. And you'll remember I told you this before, God's intention in the Old Testament was that the firstborn son of each family would act as a priest for that family. And after the golden calf, that was totally destroyed. And so then the firstborn son had to be redeemed, and his service had to be transferred to the family of priests who worked in the temple. And so we had this offering as well. It was all perfunctory. It was normal stuff. It's like if you've ever done your normal Easter stuff, your normal Christmas stuff. It was the things you did if you're a religious person. But in the midst of that, we meet two people whose example of faith becomes an example for us today. Simeon and Anna. Two characters from Luke chapter 2. Simeon is actually the person that we get a famous gospel song from. If you've ever come to one of our funerals, and at the end of the funeral you've heard me sing, "Lord, now you let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled." That's right out of the mouth of Simeon. There are three famous gospel songs, one from Mary, one from Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, and one from Simeon. So if you're ever in your faith, I've got to get less strong coffee, or take some. If you're ever in your faith and you don't know what to pray or what to sing to God, you can go to your Bible, look up the Song of Mary, look up the Song of Zechariah, look up the Song of Simeon, and they will give you words that you can speak to God. That's a great way to participate in their song. So Simeon is the first, Anna is the second. So we're going to start with Anna. She has just a few verses, but I think she's the only person in the New Testament who's called a prophetess. She's given this title as a prophetess. When she was a young lady, she got married. She was married for 7 years, and her husband died. We would imagine unexpectedly, tragically, whenever a young person dies, as we saw this week, whenever people die out of time or season, there's an air of tragedy to it, an immense tragedy. And that's Anna's husband. He dies. And then the gospel tells us that she's lived in the temple for 84 years, or she's 84 years old. You can kind of go either way. But let's just say after the death of her husband, her whole life gets connected to her life of faith and waiting. That's all she does. She waits in the temple. And what I want to have us consider today is what it means to be people of holy waiting. What does it mean to be people of holy waiting? One of the things we did with the kids on Friday is we took a little terracotta pot from Home Depot and right here dropped it on the tile. We talked about how people break, how lives break. And then we said, what are we supposed to do with all these broken pieces? We can't put them back together. And so we put them into the shape of a cross. And we said, God takes the broken pieces of our lives and makes them into this shape to tell us that it's not the end of our story. We don't stay broken forever. But until we're put back together, all we can do is wait. And we wait in hope. And we wait in crying and sadness, but we wait. And so I want you to think about, in your own life of faith, what is the time that you have waited for God to act? When have you waited? For what have you waited? And it could very well be that some of your waiting has incorporated having to take broken things and shape them into a cross. That's why in the second reading we did have today from Paul, he talks about the cross being a source of shame or foolishness. This is God's answer. This is God's answer to our grief, to our brokenness, to our sadness. This is what God gives us. And the answer is yes. God gives us one person, Jesus of Nazareth, one gift for all that will somehow deal with the entire human experience. Not just some portion of people that win a sweepstakes, not just some portion of people that are born in the right country at the right time with the right resources, for everybody. Everyone who is a human being is somehow incorporated into this gift that comes at Christmas. And so Anna has been a person who has waited her entire life for God to do something. And this morning is the day where she says, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. I have been waiting for this baby to come because he is the enfleshed love and promise of God. And we'll talk about what her waiting turns into. That other person is Simeon. Simeon gets a few more verses, but Simeon helps us capture the difficulty of waiting. Because Simeon comes to Mary, and they're Mary and Joseph, they're walking through the temple. It's just a normal day. The wise men are gone, the shepherds are gone, Christmas is long ago. Even some of what they heard at Christmas, they are pondering, but they haven't really understood. And then this old guy comes, takes the baby, and says, this is it. He's the one. God told me I would not die until I saw this gift. And then he starts singing. Now, if you went to Target, or you went even if you came to church and someone took your baby and just started singing and going, this is it. You go, well, call the police, whatever. 5150 hold. We've got somebody here who's mentally disturbed. But it's the surprising thing that in the common everyday life of people, the thing that the world has been waiting for emerges unexpectedly. And what's important to understand is that when Simeon starts singing to God, he is reminded, he says, God showed me that this would happen. And part of him saying, God showed me this would happen, is saying, God showed me what God values. And this becomes an important distinction between the world of history and the world of redeemed history, that some of what we value, God doesn't. Some of what we love and what we hold to be immensely important, God doesn't. And so when this child appears, in the midst of Simeon's waiting, this is what God values. This vulnerable human life that will be used to redeem other vulnerable human lives. And so Simeon sings that song that we sing at the end of a person's life, God, you can let me go. I've seen your salvation. He's a gift to the other nations. He's the glory of your people Israel. He's everything we could ask for. And notice, in that song, he's already saying that Jesus is going to be too big for just one group of people. He's going to be a gift for everyone, every nation, every time. There will not be a people who are somehow exempt from this gift. He becomes an important witness, and he witnesses with joy. So this is what I want to return to with this idea of waiting and witnessing, this idea of returning to where we started this week, this tragedy that affected our congregation, then also the call to witness after the events of the Holocaust, and of course others like it in the recent history of human beings since that time. And we might say that we have a few different takeaways from this that I want to lift up to you. One is, we can acknowledge the difficulty of waiting across a long life. When you think about the life you have with God, it is something different than the short-term gratification we have as happy consumers in 21st century America. The fact that Amazon will give me a package in 2 days, and I'm like, well, I can't wait till they have one-day shipping or hour shipping or whatever it is. What God is doing with us is in a different kind of economy and time. Now, it's not that God won't surprise you. God will surprise you. But the waiting can be difficult and it can be lifelong, and we can acknowledge that. Simeon says something to Mary that's very difficult in this way, because when he says, "This child is destined for the falling and rising of many," she goes, "Oh." And then he looks at her and says, "A sword will pierce your heart." Isn't that? A sword will pierce your heart. And the word that they use isn't just like a little dagger or like an assassin's blade, like hide the blade. This is like a Thracian broadsword. A big sword's going to go right through you. And he's acknowledging that part of Jesus coming into the world is going to break the heart of his mother when he goes to the cross. And so this is for all people who wait with broken hearts, for all people who wait with pierced hearts, for all people who, as we heard in the Beatitudes, are poor in spirit, for all people who are mourning, there is a blessing. It is not a kind of naive foolishness. It is not a kind of false optimism, just going, well, just think the glass is half full. I know the heart's half empty. Just think that heart's half full. Think of it that way. No, it is not a naive optimism. It is to say that even hearts pierced with grief can wait in hope. And then we can say there is a time where the period of waiting ends. Simeon and Anna are both an example that the period of waiting ends, and on the other side of holy waiting is always joy, always. Now, we can say there are a lot of things we wait for that don't end well, or a lot of things that aren't a kind of holy waiting. It's like if you've ever been waiting on the phone, like I had to call the DMV, and they go, "Your expected wait time is 2 hours and 35 minutes. Like, oh my God, and then you wait, and then they go, "Let me transfer you," and then you get cut off, and you go, "I hate," and then they go, or you call Kaiser Permanente, and they say, "Say representative, say representative, and then I'm in the office going, representative, yelling angrily at a robot into a phone. That's a feature of modern life. So luckily what we're doing with God is not like that. God is not a kind of artificial intelligence who's been programmed to respond to us in a variety of ways. The waiting that we do that is holy will always end with joy, always. Because God has promised that lives that have been pierced with swords, hearts that have been broken, lives that have been shattered into pieces, people who wait in the shadow of the cross will always have the next gift, which is Easter, which is empty tombs, which is lives restored, which is eyes opened, which is ears opened, which is people released from the darkness of the dungeon they've been in. That is our gospel hope. And so you'll notice that Anna switches from being a prophetess to a witness. And this becomes the wonderful arc now that we can connect back to the beginning, that the waiting turns into witnessing. Anna doesn't just go, "Well, that was nice, now I don't have to be here anymore." Anna begins to tell people that God is up to this. In the midst of what she's waited for, in the sorrow that she carried from the death of her own spouse, she is now telling other people in the temple that the child who came to church today is the one that God had promised and the one that was hoped for. And so our waiting turns into a kind of witnessing, and sometimes our waiting is its own witness until we get to that moment of God's joy. But part of the promise that God's given us, especially on this Candlemas Day, 40 days after Christmas, is that the light that God gives us cannot be put out. And so whatever darkness you are facing, whatever valley you are in, whatever long night that you are walking through, the light of Christ will lead you through. It will be stronger than the darkness. That was kind of the witness last night when so many people were at the pier for Christina Mauser lighting candles. Why do we light candles when we're grieving? Because we want people to know that there's light in the disorienting experience of absence and loss. So this is why I called the audible this morning, because the week seemed to necessitate it, and there will still be work to do out of this. But on this day when Jesus was brought in the normal course of events to the temple, we discover that his appearance changes our waiting, encourages our witnessing, and gives us a special task. So when we were at the Holocaust Museum on Monday, it is the task left to we the living. When we gathered with the school children last Friday, it is the task left to we the living. And even that phrase, we the living, comes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address when he talks about we the living being given the task to carry on this work. For we who are here, and for we who have the light and time that we do, let us be witnesses of hope, witnesses of steadfast waiting, and finally, people of immense joy. Amen.